Chapter 6 North Gate. Down at the North Gate, Silas Heap was playing a game of counterfeit with Gringe the gatekeeper. Silas and Gringe had recently made up a long-standing feud. When Simon Heap, Silas's eldest son, had tried to run off with and marry Gringe's only daughter Lucy, both Silas and Gringe had been horrified. Gringe had shut Lucy up in the gatehouse attic to stop her from running away again. It was not until Silas came to see him some time later with the news that Simon had gone off into the Moran marshes in the middle of the night, and had not been seen since, that Gringe had at last let Lucy out of the attic. For Gringe knew as well as anyone that the chances of surviving in the Moran marshes at night were slim. Silas and Gringe found they had a lot in common. There was Lucy and Simon for a start, and then there was counterfeit. Both Silas and Gringe had fond memories of playing counterfeit as boys. Counterfeit was now a very rare board game, although it had once been commonplace in the castle, and the Premier Counterfeit League final used to be the highlight of the year. At first sight the game appeared to be a simple board game played with counters. The counterfeit board consisted of 2 castles, divided by a river down the center. Each player had a set of counters of various shapes and sizes in their own team strip, and the aim of the game was to get as many of your own counters over the river and into the opposing player's castle. But there was a twist in the game. The counters had minds of their own, and more importantly, feet of their own. This was why the game was so popular, but unfortunately this was also the reason for the game's rarity. The charms that created the counters had been lost in the Great Fire 300 years ago, and since then most sets of counterfeit had gradually become incomplete, as over the years their counters had up and left in search of adventure, or just in search of a more interesting box of counterfeit. And while no one ever objected to opening his or her box and finding that a whole new colony of counters had taken up residence, it was a different matter when you discovered that all your counters had got bored with you and left. So 300 years later most counters had disappeared, flushed down drains, trodden into the ground, or simply having a good time in small undiscovered counter colonies under the floorboards. Most wizards, including Silas, played the magic version of counterfeit, where the castles and the river on the board were real, although smaller, of course. Ever since he was a boy, Gringe had always wanted to play with a magic set of counterfeit. When Silas had mentioned to Gringe that he actually had a complete and sealed magic counterfeit set somewhere in the attic with all his books, Gringe had miraculously overcome his long-standing dislike of the Heap family and suggested that they might perhaps have a game or two together sometime. It had soon become a regular occurrence, which both looked forward to. Earlier that morning, Silas had left the palace and taken the shortcut to the North Gate, carrying with him his precious box of counterfeit. Silas had walked slowly, for beside him loped a large, unkempt wolfhound with creaky joints. Maxie was no longer the young dog he had been, but he still went everywhere with his master. As an ordinary wizard, Silas Heap wore a deep blue tunic, fastened with a silver belt. Like all the Heaps, he had fair, curly hair, although his was now beginning to acquire a dusting of gray, but his green eyes were still bright. As he walked through the sunny, early morning streets, he hummed a contented tune to himself, for unlike Sarah Heap, Silas did not worry about anything for very long, and reckoned that things eventually turned out for the best. Silas and Gringe had sat down companionably outside the gatehouse and set up the counterfeit board, while casting expert eyes over the counters and trying to work out what their characters might be that day. Counters were fickle, and you never knew how they might turn out from one game to the next. Some counters were easily persuaded to go where you wanted them to. Others were not. Some would appear to do as you asked, and then betray you at the last minute. Some would fall asleep just when you needed them to do something important, and others would run madly around the board creating havoc. The trick was to quickly understand both your counters and your opponent's counters, then use your knowledge to get across the board and into the opposing castle. Every game was different. Some contests were chaos, some were aggressive, and the best were hilariously funny. Which is why, as Septimus appeared at the North Gate, the first thing he heard was Gringe's loud guffaw. "Ha! You didn't expect him to do a double duck, Silas, did you now? He's a right one, that little fat one is. I thought he'd do something like that. I think that puts my spare back on the board, don't you?" Gringe, a stocky, somewhat argumentative man in a leather jerkin, leaned over and took a large round counter out of a tub by the side of the board. The counter kicked its short fat legs with excitement and ran onto the board. "Hey!" protested Gringe, dismayed as the counter jumped straight into the river and disappeared into the depths of the water. You're not supposed to go in there, you little— Well, ain't this your little lad, Silas? Where did he come from, then? I don't know, you eeps just get about everywhere, you do. I'm not falling for that one, Grinch. Silas chuckled, intent on trying to persuade one of his counters, the tunneler, to squeeze into the tunnel that led under Grinch's castle. I know what you're up to, Grinch. As soon as I take my eyes off the board, your kicker will have kicked my tunneler into the river. I wasn't born yesterday, you know. But it's your little apprentice lad, Silas. I think he's up to some magic. Septimus's transport was taking some time to wear off. He still looked a bit misty. Underneath the table, Maxie whined, and the hairs on the back of his neck rose. Good try, Grinch, said Silas, trying to get his pusher to shove the tunneler under the castle without much success. No, he is here. Hello, lad. Come to see your dad, have you? At last, Silas took his eyes off the game and looked up. Oh, hello, Septimus, he said, surprised. Well, are you doing transports already? He's a clever one, my youngest. Apprentice to the extraordinary wizard, you know. Silas told Grinch, not for the first time. Really? You don't say, muttered Grinch, who had his arm up to his elbow trying to retrieve his counter from the river. He had forgotten that Silas's game was the deluxe version that came with mini crocodiles. Ouch! Yelped Grinch. Dad! Yelled Septimus. It's Jenna! Simon took Jenna! They're coming this way! Get Grinch to raise the drawbridge, quick! What? Silas could see Septimus's lips moving, but he could hear nothing. Septimus was not quite there yet. Raise the drawbridge, Dad! Septimus's voice came back on the last word. Yes, what is it? No need to shout, Septimus. The clatter of horses' hooves sounded behind them, and Septimus knew it was too late. He jumped out in front of the horse in a last desperate attempt to stop them, but Silas grabbed hold of him and pulled him back. Careful! You'll get yourself trampled! Simon's horse thundered by Jenna. Jenna shouted something to Septimus and Silas, but her words were lost in the thudding of the horse's hooves and the rush of the wind as the huge black horse sped past. Septimus, Silas, and Grinch watched the horse with its two riders go pounding over the drawbridge. When they reached the dirt track on the other side, Simon pulled the horse sharply to the right, and with its hooves slipping on the dry dirt as it turned, the horse sped off toward the North Road. The North Road, as Septimus knew from his map studies in the young army, led along the river, over the one-way bridge, and after a day's fast riding, would take them into the border country, or Badlands, as it was often called in the castle. Disgusting! Exclaimed Silas, staring after the horse. That was a case of reckless riding if ever I saw one. Showing off to his girlfriend, that's all it was. Young men should not be allowed to fast horses, if you ask me. With them, it's always speed, with no thought of anyone else. Dad! Shouted Septimus, desperately trying to get a word in. Dad, that was Simon! Simon? Silas looked confused. What do you mean? Our Simon? It's Simon, and he's taken Jenna. Taken her where? Why? What is going on? Why doesn't anybody ever tell me anything? Silas sat down again, aware that the day was beginning to go wrong and not sure exactly why. I'm trying to tell you, said Septimus, exasperated. That was Simon, and he's— But Septimus was interrupted again. Lucy Grinch, a pretty girl with deep brown eyes and light brown hair tied into two long plaits that hung to her waist, had appeared at the gatehouse door. She wore a simple, long white summer tunic which she had embroidered herself with an odd assortment of flowers, and on her feet was a pair of heavy brown boots laced up with pink ribbon. Lucy was well known for her unusual approach to clothes. Simon? Asked Lucy, looking pale under her freckles. Did you say that was Simon? Lucy, I will not have you mention that name here, growled Grinch, staring at the counterfeit board and wondering how such an enjoyable morning could suddenly turn into such a nightmare. But, he told himself sternly, he should have known better. Wasn't that always the way with the Heaps? They were nothing but trouble. Yes, it was Simon, and he has taken Jenna away, said Septimus flatly, the urgency gone from his voice as he realized that it was too late now to do anything about it. But, murmured Silas, I don't understand. Lucy Grinch understood. She understood only too well. Why? She screamed. Why didn't he take me?